start it and pray and yeah. It's all right. All right. But as we go to get started, Sister Jenny has asked that we remember Ashley's mother as we pray tonight. They found out that she's got cancer again for the fifth time, so let's remember this. Sister George said GC, his knee is hurting, swelled, he felt work. Remember, pray for Tammy's mom. Um, she fell, broke her nose today. Uh, got a nasty knot on her head. Uh, Depends how she might watch this. I'll refrain from calling her a knothead. Um, but pray for all these. Is there anybody else got a request, Ben Howard? Your your niece and the baby? Yes. Um, as we was getting the update on the baby, just pray for the baby. Isaac be having his surgery. I guess he goes Friday to find out about his surgery. So pray for Isaac on his knee. Anyone else? All right. Uh, Pastor Lonnie, would you like to open us up in prayer? All right. We're jumping into chapter 12 tonight. So as of last week, we did make it to the halfway point of Revelations. Still got a lot to cover. Um, I was telling Pastor Lonnie, I know after chapter 1, I've been trying to cover 2 chapters a week. I'm not sure on chapters 12 and 13 that I'm going to be able to do that. There's a lot of information in 12 or 13. I'm going to try to go fairly quickly like we have been. At any point in time that you need me to slow down, go back over something, just throw something at me, wave your hand, do something, and we'll slow down and we'll go back over it. But there is a lot of information in these chapters, and we're going to be talking. We're going to be talking a lot today about what most theologians refer to as it's theoretical theology, because we really don't know exactly what they're saying, but we have some clues to what they're saying. Does that make sense? I mean, when you get into chapter 12 and 13, we're going to be flipping back and forth, and part of the reason there's so much material is because in order to understand Revelations 12, we have to go back to Daniel. So we're going to be flipping back and forth a lot between Revelations and Daniel when we go into chapters 12 and 13. So, as we get started, It says, verse 1, it says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars." What's gonna be actually very interesting? Have we got anybody in here that's familiar with the Catholic Church at all? If you've noticed, this is the image that the Catholic Church paints of Mary. However, most Bible theologians does not believe this represents Mary. The Catholic Church is convinced that this image is Mary. If you see a lot of Catholicism pictures of Mary, they're going to represent her with the sun shining behind her, and she's going to be standing on the moon, and there's going to be a halo of 12 stars around her head. You've seen the picture. Yeah, you know exactly the image I'm talking about. It's the image, Virgin Mary, the mother of Christ. I mean, that's the image they paint. However, most Bible theologians does not believe this represents Mary, and we will get into a little bit extensively what we're talking about. But most Bible theologians believe that this woman represents Israel as a whole. And we'll get into that. There's going to actually be, this is the first of 7 great signs that we discuss in Revelations 12, 13, and 14. And I'm gonna briefly, because it's important right here to know the great signs, and we will go over them in detail as we go through it. But the first one is the woman representing Israel. The second great sign is the dragon representing Satan. The third is the man-child, which represents Jesus. The next is the angel Michael, the head of the angelic hosts. The next is the offspring of the woman, representing the Gentiles that come to faith through the tribulation. The beast out of the sea, which represents the Antichrist, and the beast out of the earth, which represents the false prophet. All right? So those are our 7 great signs that we're going to be looking at as we move forward. So remember, this is a great sign. So when we're talking about this, we're not expecting this like the two witnesses. We're not expecting this to be a person who appears. And a lot of times, especially in prophecy, and definitely when they're referring to in several cases in Revelations, which we'll talk about, when they refer to women, they're talking about religious systems. Remember, the church is referred to as the bride. So the church is referred to as the bride because it's referring to it as a religious system. Remember when we talk about Jezebel, we're talking about false teachings. We'll get that later in Revelation. Well, we got that in Revelations chapter 2. In Revelation 17, we'll get the great harlot, which represents false religion as a whole. We'll also get to, as we know in Revelations 19, we'll get that reference back to the bride, which represents the church. So we're pretty certain here that he's referring, when he talks about this woman, he's referring to the nation of Israel, and we'll talk about she's clothed with the sun. If we go back to Genesis chapter 37, see, I told you we're going to be going back and forth a lot. If we go back to Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 through 11, we get Joseph's dream that represents, the sun represented Jacob, the moon represented Joseph's mother, Rachel and the 11 stars were the sons of Israel, which bowed down to Joseph. We know when we talked about the 7 churches of Asia, when they talked about the 12 tribes, they referred back to the house of Joseph. So Joseph then becomes the missing 12th tribe. So the 12 stars is the 12 tribes of Israel. So here when we see this picture in relation to Joseph's dream, we know that what they're talking about here is the same image that Joseph painted of Jacob. So this in return must be the house of Israel. Because you're not going to have two prophecies with exactly the same image meaning two different things. It says, and we know there's many times that Israel is represented as a woman in the Old Testament. Isaiah 54, Jeremiah 3, Ezekiel 16, Hosea chapter 2 refers to Israel as a woman. So we get to verse 2, it says, then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. So we find that she is in the pains of labor. And this pain, when you find this travail that is talking about, is the travail that Israel was in at the birth of Christ. We know his very birth, they were seeking to kill him at his birth. So we get Israel was in Roman bondage. It says in verse. So we switch from the woman, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. So here we have another sign. So we're not looking at literally a dragon appearing, but we know the term dragon, that is synonymous with Satan. We're actually going to get several names for Satan. Say, Satan the deceiver, the dragon, the beast. But we're talking about Satan here, the red dragon, and it was a great, fiery red dragon. When you refer to fiery in visions, it typically symbolizes rage or vengeance. Well, we know Satan is enraged. Why? Because he's done lost once. He sought to overthrow God to start with. So he's got 7 diadems on his head. A diadem is a crown. It is a symbol of royal authority. We know Satan tried to put himself as God. He has tried to usurp God's authority and set himself in place on the throne instead of God. So we find that these diadems, because it referred. Notice we had crowns earlier, which was used for the term rewards. So notice this ain't the same word. These are a claim for authority. So we find here that he is making the claim that he has authority. When we look at this, we find a similar description that we'll find again in chapter 13, and we find parallel references in Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8. And when we look at this, a lot of Bible scholars, when they refer to Satan and the satanic rule, it references back to the Roman government, because that was the government they were under. And really and truly, the Roman government was really one of the most oppressive governments in history. And whenever you start studying end-time theologies, a lot of theologians, when the one world government comes back, it's going to be related back to this Roman government. Because remember, Rome was a world government. At the time, they were the world government. So what we're going to find is, as we're talking about this new Roman Empire, it may not be the Roman Empire as we know it, but it's going to be a reformation of what they knew as the Roman Empire, which means they're going to be a world dominant dictatorship who is going to replace the service of God to the worship of Caesar, or the worship of the leader, right? Because literally, when we get to the mark of the beast, it literally, if you study world history, what I'm fixing to get in trouble before I even get to it. When you study world history, in the Greek, they use numbers to represent people. If you find the remains of Pompeii in one of the walls, they found so and so loved so and so, and her number was written on one of the walls. What it did is, if you took those numbers, you could spell out their name. So what he was saying was, it was a secret love, and he couldn't confess it out loud. So he put her numbers down, and that represented who she was. And if you went through the process of the letters and what it spelled out, it would spell out her name. Well, there's only one person in history that 666 spells out their name, and that is Nero Caesar, who was the Roman emperor at the time that John was writing this. So what we're gonna, and he was very enthusiastic about putting Christians to death, because he wanted them to burn incense and worship Caesar. Well, I didn't realize it was going to get that quiet this early. So we're finding here, so the 7 heads and the 10 horns, they refer to the original 10 kingdoms of Rome. Well, why is there? Why? So there was 10 kingdoms and there was 7. Why was there 7? Because we know that the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 and 8, which were destroyed. So we get the 10 and 7. All right. Everybody still with me? If you're vaguely with me, shake your head like a chicken pecking corn. All right. All right. This says in verse 4, his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now that's a pretty clear image. When Satan was cast out of heaven, we know from other verses what happened. He took a third of the angels with him. So when he took and we know in other places when it refers to the stars of heaven, he's referring to what? Angels. So here it's pretty clear who we're talking about. We're talking about Satan, and he took a third of the angels with him. And he is there at the point of birth to devour the child. We know that's exactly what Satan's plan was, right? So we're going to move on. I think that verse is pretty clear. Once we put it in perspective of the time period we're talking about and what we're looking at, that brings that scripture pretty well to light. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Okay, now once that we've established that the woman is Israel, the offspring of Israel, the ruler of Israel is Christ. So now we have that Christ comes to earth, that we get this image of ruling with a rod of iron in several other places. Psalms 2 and 9, Revelations 19 and 15. We get several places where we know Christ will rule with a rod of iron, and basically a rod. If we go back to Psalms 23, we know that the shepherds, their rod and their staff, they comforted the shepherd. They comforted David. Well, why a rod and a staff? Well, they were used for very different things. A staff typically had a hook on it. And what it was used for, it was used to gently move the sheep to where you wanted them. If the sheep wasn't going where you want, you sort of took the shepherd's crook and you basically persuaded them gently to go where you wanted them. The rod was the other side of the staff. And it was used when the shepherd's crook wasn't working. The other end is what they used to get the sheep in line. My mama called that a good old-fashioned whooping. And when the shepherd is when David is talking in Psalms 23, when he says, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me," he was saying, I'm thankful that God tries to gently persuade me, and when I don't listen, he takes a stick and whoops my hind end. And it comforts me. Why? Because the shepherd wouldn't bother to discipline him if he didn't love him. So we know that he's going to rule with a rod of iron. Why is it important that it's a rod of iron? Because it's not going to bend. So when he brings judgment, it's going to be unbending. And the child was caught up to God and his throne. Well, we know that's exactly what happened with Christ, right? So we're going to move on. Now, that's all pretty clear so far. And when the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. If y'all haven't noticed, that's a reoccurring number in Revelation, and it's also a reoccurring number in Daniel. For those of you that's trying to do the math, that's 3.5 years still. It should be an easy number for us now. It's represented multiple ways in multiple verses, but they all still add up to 3.5 years. Which is also why most theologians believe this no longer represents Mary, but it represents Israel as a whole. So we know that Israel is going to be taken care of by God. We know that from the 144,000, right? Which the 144,000, we know that's multiples of 12, and it's 12 the 12 times to the 12, and you're looking at the 12 tribes of Israel being taken care of. So we know that Israel is going to be taken care of during the tribulation. All right. But what's actually very interesting is the word that's used for prepared is actually the same verse that the word that John uses when he talks about in the ancient Greek, when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you. It is a denotation of pre-planned. He's not planning to prepare a place, but the place, it's already planned, and all he has to do is go make the final preparations. And we really are getting the similar look here. So if we know that Jesus is going to prepare a place for us as his children, we know that the original covenant was with Israel, so he actually is making the same promise to Israel during the tribulation, that I'm going to prepare a place for you to take care of you. All right. Are we all together? Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty and what people get into fisticuffs over. I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. Revelations chapter, so we're looking at starting at 7, verse 8. It says, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. All right. And I'm going to talk about two schools of thought on this. There is a school of thought that thinks that this battle has long since taken place, And this is a re-reference to Satan being cast out of heaven the first time. Now, there is a second group that would make the argue, well, Satan was clearly back into heaven because there's multiple places where he is found at the throne of God accusing God's children. And we know that after this battle, there will be no longer a place for him there to come to accuse. Basically, his accusations are coming to a stop. Now, we've sort of talked about this before, and now here is where things get interesting. When we was talking about there's the school of thought that Michael is the pre-incarnate Christ. Well, here's the scriptures that we're going to use to rebut that. Because they're arguing if that was the case, we now have Christ and we have Michael and the angels now fighting. That only works if this battle had already occurred. Does that make sense? Because he no longer is, if Michael represented the pre-incarnate Christ, and this is taking place now as opposed to then, it would not refer to him as Michael, right? Okay. See, I told you we would discuss that topic further. Now, like I said, I'm going to present to you, we're studying Revelations, I'm going to present to you everything that has been presented. And I'll let you study deeper and see what you want to think. But these are the scriptures that they use to say, no, we understand where you're coming from. But Michael, just as Satan was, we know Satan, they refer to Michael in another place, they're going to refer to him as a prince. We know that he was the prince of Israel, or he was the protector of Israel. We know that Satan was the prince of this world. So what we're going to make this assumption that these archangels are these seraphims. That we know Satan was a seraphim. We know that Michael was a seraphim. We've had other discussions on seraphims, which means fiery lizard. Now we've got this dragon. But as we look at this, we make the argument that Michael was not the pre-incarnate of Christ. Told you we was going to be discussing that farther. So, and part of the argument is when we look at Michael, his name himself, it literally means one like God. Like I said, I'm just throwing the information out. But as we discussed when we talked about this the other day, what does the Bible says it takes for me to be saved? I have to acknowledge that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God and one with God, that he died for me, and I'm lost, and I confess with my mouth and believe in my heart unto salvation. So at this point in time when we're discussing this, it's still, I want to point this out again, it still doesn't make a difference in my salvation whether he was or not. Right? Okay. So as we move forward, so we know that Michael and his angels fought with the dragons and So what we find here very interesting is that the dragon loses his representation in heaven as a result of this fight. And we do know that Christ has been making intercession. So there is this argument that this fight has been going on through the ages. And it's accumulating in this vision in Revelation. So what we find is he's no longer able to accuse the saints. So we also know when we look at this that this is not a physical battle but a spiritual battle. We get this picture several times in the Bible. And actually, they told us we fight not against flesh and blood, but against what? Principalities and powers. See, our fight isn't against mankind. Our fight is not physical. Our fight is spiritual. And likewise, this fight that's occurring is a spiritual fight. I know several individuals that when praying, when they are praying for somebody who is fighting addiction, they are fighting on spiritual planes in their life. I know people, when they go in and pray for those people, have claimed to see spiritual battles. And they said it's a very scary place to see. Because I believe that there are battles right now going on in spiritual realms for our soul. All right. So we're going to move on to verse 9. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceived the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So once again, we get this term devil, which literally it's the Greek, comes from the Greek word diablos, or diablo, which means the defaming or the slanderous one. The deceiver. The word literally, when it calls him the deceiver, Satan, the term Satan literally means, because it's actually interesting that Satan, who deceives, literally the term Satan means the deceiver. Remember, the original sin was they were deceived. Satan took the word, just enough of the word of God, and twisted it to deceive mankind. And what we're fixing to find as we go from chapter 12 into chapter 13, that the deceiver has a plan to deceive the entire earth. We know, see in here, and we know in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So here, like I said, you get the different sides of the theology. Like I said, most theologians refer to this as theoretical theology because we're talking in theory. Was it the original being cast out, or was it a separate being cast out, unable to deceive? Or is it an ongoing, continued process of that fight? All right. Verse 10 and 12. 10 through 12. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. Now, here's the verse where most theologians say this is a new casting out. If this was a continued battle, it has definitely had a finite end in these verses. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea. For the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that his time has that he knows he has a short time. And here is where, when I look at these, I think this is at least a definitive separate casting out from Christ, saying that Satan was cast out of heaven. Because what we find here, and we find into the image that Satan, that we know that through several scriptures, Satan was coming back before the throne of God, and he was throwing believers past back up into God. But we know that the problem with that is that when he's throwing up our past, when God goes, I can imagine now Satan saying, do you know what Brother Lonnie did? That Lonnie did 20 years ago? God's going, no, I don't remember that. Why? Because God cast it where? Into the sea of forgetfulness. So all this stuff about our past that Satan keeps bringing up, God's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Did it mean it didn't happen? No, just God, when he forgave us of it, it's gone. And what's actually very interesting in here is that, and this is where people believe that this is talking about believers coming out of the tribulation because they loved, because the word of their testimonies, they did not love their lives to the death. We know that there is definitely a theological principle that there's going to be a group that comes up and is saved out of the tribulation, and they're martyrs for Christ. They're going to refuse to get the mark. They're going to be persecuted. They're going to live in utter turmoil. And they're going to be put to death just like Christians were under Nero. And through the word of their testimony, the blood of Christ is going to be applied to their life, and they're going to be accounted among the believers. But what I love in this verse is why is the dragon fiery? Why is the dragon mad? Because he knows that he has a short time. All right. And there is no way I'm getting through both chapters because I'm only at verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time. Remember, when it talks about times, it's a span of time. So we know that there's going to be an extended, and what they actually refer to. Remember when we talked about the 3.5 years may not be actually 3.5 years, because when it talks about years, it's talking about a span of time. When we get a time, and a span of time, we have 2.5 spans of time. 3.5 years is 2.5. The 3.5 spans of time. I mean, so we could be looking at very similar situations here. We're talking about spans of time. From the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like the flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, and the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. We know that over many, many periods of time, Satan has attempted to destroy God's children. Because the original covenant, now here's where good Christians get upset. The original covenant is not with us. I'm sorry, Christians, God's original covenant was not with you. You became a joint heir to the covenant. The covenant was made with whom? With Israel through Abraham, right? So the original covenant was with Abraham, which we get to why there is a war in the Middle East, because they're both claiming to be the child of covenant. And as we begin to study Revelation, when we look at that into the view of Revelation, we know that this third world war is going to occur in the Middle East, and it's going to come about because of the claim to the covenant. So everybody that says, oh, it's getting better, they're wrong. It ain't going to get better. But she's given 2 wings of the great eagle. What's actually very interesting is we get the image of the deliverance from Egypt, from Exodus 19:4. So it's talking about an emergency evacuation, not a fight. So we know at some point in time there's going to be an emergency evacuation of Israel. And the earth is going to take care of Israel. Very similar to Isaiah 59:19. It says, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard against him. And I'm sure the dragon is happy now. Verse 17, it says, and the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who kept the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So here we get that of her other offspring. So we know her first offspring, the offspring of promise, was who? The man-child. So that is Jesus, right? So we're talking about the same woman, so we're still talking about Israel, and her other children are those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Hey, now it's talking about us. We're the other children. Now, these other children, at this point in time, we, as the already existing other children, are hoping that we're not here. Depends on which theory of the rapture you subscribe to. Like we said, personally, enough information, I believe in the midpoint. But if that is true, if you believe in the midpoint, we're still here, because the midpoint comes with the desolation of the temple, which has not happened yet. See, remember when we're talking about this, the events occurring in Revelation are not chronological, which is why it makes it so hard to create a timeline. Well, I got people really staring at me now. All right. So the dragon is enraged, and he's gonna make war with the church. I believe to some extent we could well be living in the war with the church. When have you seen the church as attacked as it is today? The church represents to the world a message of evil, a message of hate, a message of intolerance. I believe to some extent we could well be within that time period, Brother Lonnie, where the beast is making war with the offspring. I'm not saying we are, but there's enough signs. He said to watch the signs. And if you watch the signs, we're at least close enough that we should be at least have a weary eye, Brother Jim. Because if we ain't in the middle of it, we're on the edge of it. All right. Any quick questions before we? And I've got about 15 minutes, and I can't get through all of it, but we'll start the next chapter if I can get it to open. We know we had all kinds of problems last week. It kept pulling up gibberish last week. I'd never seen it do that. It was nothing but a page full of symbols on my tablet. All righty. We ready to move on? And I know I'm not going to get through all this, but we'll get started. So then I stood on the sand of the sea. Well, first thing we notice that John's position has changed. Where has John been up to this point? We've sort of had this ongoing discussion. Up to this point, where has John been? He's been in the throne room, right? He's been watching everything that's happening from the throne room. All of his visions, everything that's been going on, he's been in the throne room. He's not anymore. Then I stood on the sand of the sea. So what this implies, everything that we've been talking about so far is occurred on spiritual realms. What we're going to be talking about from here on is not going to be occurring on spiritual realms. It's going to be a very physical confrontation. Is everybody with me on this? So we're back on earth. And I stood on the sands of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, different word, and on his heads a blasphemous name. So we get him. What's actually very interesting, why is he coming out of the sea? The sea was a very feared place to the children of Israel. We actually know that Israel under Solomon had a navy, but we know in 1 Kings chapter 9 and 25, they couldn't get any men from Israel to man it. So the king of Tyre supplied all the sailors for Israel's army. I think people just learned something new. The sea was always referred to as a mysterious evil place, but that God has control over. Psalms 74 verses 12 and 13 says, "For God is my king from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea with your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters." So the psalmist knew even though they feared the sea, God was still in control of what they feared. So we get this beast coming out of the evil, tumultuous sea. So he closely resembles the dragon, but he is not the dragon. We have 10 horns. Remember, horns in prophecy represent strength. So make no mistake, this beast has strength. It has some authority. What we find here is referred to, the word Antichrist only appears 5 times in the Bible, in 4 verses. 1 John chapter 2 verse 18, 1 John chapter 2 verse 22, 1 John 4 and chapter 3, and 2 John verse 7. So what we are seeing here is the Antichrist. He is not the dragon, but he is like the dragon. What I want you to start picturing, and we're fixing to have one more coming along, for a total of how many? 3. We know that Satan is trying to do what? He is trying to set himself up to the world as who? God. So we know if he is trying to be like God, and this beast is like the dragon. So the Antichrist literally means like Christ. So what we see here is Satan is setting up his unholy trinity. There is a second trinity referenced in Revelations, because he is trying to mimic God, because he can't be God. So many times the word that is translated Antichrist, we translate that opposite to Christ. And we think that he's going to come and he's going to do horrendous things, which he is. But the term literally means instead of. The word that literally translates to Antichrist, it literally translates instead of the Christ. We know Christ was not his name, but it was a title, right? So he is instead of Christ. What he is looking to do is remember the Jews are still looking for the Messiah. He is going to come and he is going to present himself with signs and wonders that he is the coming Christ. He's not going to come with a mouth full of evil. He's going to come with a mouth full of deceit, just as the dragon. And he's going to try to present himself as the Savior of the earth. And there's going to be millions deceived because they're looking for somebody wicked and corrupt doing out and out evil. Well, the problem is the evil that he's going to do, he's already conditioning us that is good and that we've been wrong for centuries. If God had a plan, don't think for a minute that Satan ain't had one since he fell from heaven. In order to deceive, you have to plan. The Bible actually gives him many names. We call him, most commonly we call him Antichrist. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8 referred to him as the little horn. Daniel 8 and 23 referred to him the king of fierce countenance. Daniel 9 and 26 referred to him the prince that shall come. Daniel 11 and 36 through 45 refers to him as the willing king. John 5 and 43 refers to him as the one who comes in his own name. 2 Thessalonians 2 and 3 refers to him as the son of perdition, the man of sin, the lawless one. And it's very interesting, and this is why, and a lot of this, a lot of theology on Revelations. There was a lot of Revelation studies going on in the early 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And they began to look at this. He comes in his own name. Well, we've sort of talked about this subject a lot, haven't we? What we're still referring to here once again, is the term that was used back in those days as secular humanism. I am my own what? God. So he's coming in his own name. So remember, we're being conditioned today, into today's society, we're being conditioned that there are many paths to heaven, and that we are our own God and we make our own path to heaven. So we are, the society today is setting us up for the Antichrist to come, and as John put it, the one who comes in his own name, because he's going to come and say, I am the Savior, make your path to heaven. That is why I think secular humanism is the most destructive religious concept on earth. Because it's the only one that you find referring to the Antichrist. Oh my. See, I went from meddling to just down and out serious. That's why you hear me so often when I'm teaching. There are so many teachings in the New Testament warning us about humanism. Remember, what was the original sin? I know we call it all kinds of things, but what was it? Be like God. It's the original sin. It's what Satan has been twisting God's children with since the beginning of time. It's going to be the same message he comes with as the Antichrist. When he sets up his Antichrist, that's going to be the message. I'm going to save you. You can be like God. We know Daniel, when it talks about his name is blasphemy, Daniel 7:25 said he's going to be speaking blasphemy against God. His very name will be blasphemy to God. So we see here still the link between Daniel. All right. It says, Daniel 7 says, now have I got time? Let's get into that next week. Because if I get into this, that's going to be a 30-minute conversation. Is that all right? I know I'm ending a few minutes early, but if I get into this next part on Daniel and the beast, because it's important because it talks about the nations and the kingdoms. Because when we're talking about these beasts, remember we're talking about kingdoms, not an individual person or thing. So we'll cut it right here. And